you, it may be that what it should be after. For some of you may want that lofty goal of being able to run a half or even a full marathon. For us, we believe that we are probably the right team, especially here in Melbourne, to help make sure that every step counts along the way. So I do have to give a little bit of a kudos to our sponsors. Who we have over here? We have Lee from ASICS, who's been incredibly kind to donating time tonight. He's got some test kits for us to try on a little bit later. So if you want to try out a shoe or something a little bit more protective, have a chat to him, have a try on. But ASICS has also been incredibly kind to the two door prizes tonight. I'll tell you where they are in a moment, so I won't go through that. The other one is probably for the first time I've got my dear friend Renee Fuller from the Rain Company in Yarraville. She's also been incredibly kind to donate their time as well as the door prize. So there's not going to be one door prize. So for me, Renee is probably my greatest source of running shoe information. And what she doesn't know about running shoes. So guys, that's true. So I reckon we start the night off on a pretty bit of a high. So the first two door prizes are chair. So I have a look. And there is a solid A. Feel free to move across the chair.
Hopefully it's not on a blank chair.
Sorry, it might be on a blank one.
I'd move seats quickly. Try another one.
Nearest reward to people up front. It is a logo. You got this one?
Ooh, well done.
Please come up to me at the end of the night and we'll organise that for you. The last one, our last one is presented by Renee, and it's going to be for their question. So please speak up, ask questions. But for us, let me hand over to my colleagues, Shannon Owen.
Beautiful. Thanks, Sammy. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I was going to use beautiful Melbourne spring as well as my intro, but yeah, this is what it's turned on for us. But seriously, how good is Melbourne during spring when we can get out on those crisp mornings? We have some great running options in Melbourne, like things like the Tan, Albert Park Lake. I was getting around there this morning. Royal Park, fantastic running tracks and options for us. And really, there is no better time than this time of year in Melbourne for its running opportunities. Also, we've got the grand final this week. How good is that? Probably maybe some South Melbourne or Fitzroy supporters in the room. And then that culminates and sort of leads into the Spring Racing Carnival. So there's no better time, I think, in Melbourne than springtime. But we're here tonight. We're all runners of some sort, shape or size, whether we're training for a marathon, a half, we're trying to get a 10K in, or we're just trying to stay healthy and get that summer body in check. We're all here to talk about running, and the theme of tonight is where every step counts. And as clinicians and treating runners all the time, we see that people come in with problems that we notice and they don't specifically can pick up, or you won't be able to pick up. And this sort of signifies the importance of every step and how your body interacts with the ground at every step. So tonight is going to be focused on how your foot interacts with the ground and how your body really communicates with the ground at every step. And so we talk about how the inside environment connects to the outside environment. And we'll cover that as we go on, but we'll get into it. But really, if we're thinking about we're all runners and we're all trying to achieve something, what is our internal driver for running? And Simon Sinek, the self-improvement guru, would always come back to start with your why. Why do you want to run? Is it for the sense of achievement, that accomplishment that comes from knowing you've completed a marathon, you've ticked off a PB? We know as every step of the way we get these dopamine releases that are really addictive for us and really keep us propelling forwards on our journey. You might be that adrenaline junkie that loves the endorphin rush and pushing your body to the limit and seeing how far you can get. You might be going for that ultra marathon. It might be that you're an old hack, retired, washed up amateur athlete like me, and you've still got that competitive urge inside you. I do a bit of running, and many years ago now, I had a run with let's call it a frenemy, and we were sort of at odds at each other, and he was racing me, I wasn't, and we were doing Run for the Kids, and we took off, and he went for it really early and thought he had me covered, and so I just plugged away, do what I do, kept the legs ticking over, every step counts, and got to the end, and he sort of looked over his shoulder and saw me coming, so he was like, well, I better put the foot down. And thinking there's only a couple of 100 metres left, he put the foot down. Little did he know there's 2 Ks to go. And so as I crossed the finish line, and this story gets a lot of mayo on it when I used to tell the footy club, but there's medical, paramedics running everywhere, there's choppers coming in, there's oxygen on him, but he was really had passed out at the line, and the bottom line really here is that he went too hard, and his competitive beast got a hold of him, and it did not work out very well for him when he was DNF in the paper the next day, and I had my time sitting there, so I sent him that with a smile on my face. But the lesson there is, don't let the competitive beast get a hold of you, but it still can be an internal driver for why you might be running. So let's have a think about our running styles. Now, this might provide a little bit of a laugh, or you might think you're looking in the mirror and watching yourself. The idea of this is to see these guys look pretty funny, but they're pretty individual, aren't they, really? If we have a look at the individual styles, we've got almost the race walker, the geezer. We've got this guy's high knees, he doesn't need to be. We've got the flightless bird with no arm swing, leaning forwards, and the rigor mortis stiff run. So have a look at these and think, what do I connect with? What do I look like when I run? And really the key point here is that each of these guys, there is no right or wrong technique. They're all right in their own right. And it's not about the technique per se, it's more about building up the capacity to adapt and cope with the technique you have. If you do have an injury though, as we'll get to later, we may have to drill down on this technique and make some short-term changes to manage that injury. But at the end of the day, I don't want you to walk out of tonight thinking, I have to run in this certain specific gait or way. Everyone is unique and individual. I'll hand over to Jake, and he's going to cover a bit more about biomechanics and footwear and pressure system.
Beautiful.
Over to you, Jake.
Thanks, Ross. I reckon you're a bit of a rigor mortis, mate.
I definitely am, 100%.
All right, so after that video, you guys might not be thinking there's much art to running, but I promise you that there is. When would you? Maybe after I finish my part. Yeah. All right, so running is the greatest biomechanical feat of the human body. So we've got 3.5 times our body weight coming in through each leg as we're taking each step when we're running. We've got 29 different muscles alone impacting each foot with every step we're taking. Now, it's not even looking further up the chain with our knees, hips, looking into our posture, how our arms are moving. There's a lot of different components that need to work harmoniously in order for it to be running well. So when we've got, thanks, that's not good. Cool. So when we've got a lot of different variables, what happens is there can be a risk that some of these variables might not be working as well as they should be, and that's what we've seen a lot of runners coming in. There'll be parts of our running that is really, really good, but then there's other areas where things could be working more harmoniously. All right, so this next slide, guys, is a snippet from the marathon at the Paris Olympics just gone. I want you to have a look and notice the different running techniques with these runners. Obviously, these guys are at the absolute top tier end running in the marathon in Paris. Watch their ankles, have a look at their feet, where their feet are hitting the ground. Notice their spring as they're pressing up and pressing through. Also notice that all of the runners are wearing different footwear as well. So it's not just one shoe fits all. Finding the right runner and finding the right footwear for yourself is extremely important. All right, so what is running? We're breaking it down into two phases that we're going to be focusing on tonight. So the first is your aerial phase, which is looking at how long you're in the air for. So think about springing up off the ground, that stiffness through your muscles, propelling you forward. One of the key indicators with this phase is strengthening, which Sauce is going to go over a little bit later on. What we're going to be focusing on more so now is the ground contact phase. So when your feet are hitting the ground, first of all, looking at how our feet are hitting the ground, so what part of our foot might be striking the ground first. But then we're also going to be zooming in a little bit as well, looking at what's actually happening inside the shoe. Where are these pressures going with our feet? How do we identify them? And then what can we do to alter and improve some of these?
Stuff that you're doing. So the biggest sort of mistakes that we see people coming in are ill-fitting shoes or shoes that aren't necessarily designed to adapt to where you are getting the load or sort of complement areas like that. So when people ring up or come in and talk to us about what sort of shoes and gait analysis and what we're sort of looking at, it's really comforting to hear a lot of the stuff up there in terms of it's not the right way or the wrong way, or people go, I'm running wrong, or can you have a look at my gait to see where I need to make changes and where I need to make things better. I suppose what we're looking at in our gait analysis in terms of shoe prescription comes down to a lot of questions and a lot of background. So in terms of that, we're looking at and having a conversation that starts off before we even get you up onto the treadmill. So the sort of questions that we need to know and we need to take into consideration and you guys need to be thinking about are, what shoes are you currently using, how those shoes are actually fitting, so we're going to look at those sort of things, what you're actually training for, and then we need to then look at, in terms of what we're training for, do we think that those shoes are appropriate for that? And then we're looking at, do you have any injury concerns? And if so, what actually are they? So they're sort of the questions that we're looking at and you should be thinking of prior to going into getting shoes. They're the things that people are going to ask you or should be asking you when you're going to get shoes. That information tells us so much already. To be honest, we already know so much already as soon as you walk through the door and we look at your shoes that you're already wearing. Like I said, the biggest mistake is most people are coming in shoes that they think they should be wearing or just necessarily ill-fitting. We spoke a little bit, or you spoke a little bit about what your shoe, like your foot does within a shoe. That pressure pad thing's super cool, by the way. But I suppose what we look at is how that shoe fits and how your foot can then spread and disperse load within that shoe. So things like that are ill-fitting and things that you need to be aware of are the shoes too tight? Do I have room at the end of my toe? Can I wiggle my toes? Am I slipping out? All these types of things that are going to, I suppose, create load in areas that we don't want if we're not able to spread our toes and if we're not able to disperse that load within the shoe quite evenly. A thing that I'll talk about with some of the shoes that we've got over here and like in terms of shoe prescription is also the surface area that your foot is sitting on. So that's where different styles of shoes are, I suppose, very exciting, and there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of social media on what shoes are the best and all these racing shoes and carbon plated shoes and what's going to make us run faster. But I suppose at the end of the day, those shoes are amazing and they provide a really good experience. But what that doesn't sort of show you is where your foot's sitting within that shoe, where you're landing, where you're loading, and where then I suppose that load's getting forced. From there, the gait analysis that we look at on the treadmill and when we look at you from behind running barefoot, that just provides us information that backs up the information you've already given us. So if someone was injured and we're looking at the movement at that lower ankle and the leg to see where we're landing, where we're loading, so the same sort of thing where you first land in your mid-stance when you're fully weight bearing, and then when you're in that swings phase where you're sort of toeing off and dispersing that load, we can look at and say, okay, I'm getting sore here, or I'm getting load here, this is where I'm like getting, blisters or I'm getting pain in the outside of my leg, then we can have a look at that movement and say, actually, when I have a look at you up on the treadmill, you are actually forcing a lot of load to that area. You're landing very heavily there. These types of things is where we'll look at that movement. What we don't do is look at that movement and say that it's necessarily wrong, necessarily that we have to correct it, or we have to go into a supportive shoe, or we have to do this, or we have to move away. What we want to do is just try to complement those areas. So if there is one area that's getting a lot of load, do we want to be in something that's really soft and unstable in that area? Maybe not. Maybe we want something that's going to be a little bit more stable, that's going to, I suppose, give a little bit more feedback and a little bit more support when we're landing in through those areas. So I suppose it's not our job to say that that's right or wrong. If we are getting injured, we're going to try to make that look a little bit better, and we're going to try and make sure that whatever shoe we're going to put on or prescribe or try on your foot is going to feel better there and support that area that we're getting that load in. If we don't have any injuries, and you would have seen there, which is I think is always really interesting when you watch the elite runners run, they look like their ankles are going to break. They're running in racing shoes. They definitely don't look like their mechanics and everything are right. They're landing, they're loading in, they're getting a lot of movement, but yet they're running marathons and they're not injured, and they're running 2-hour marathons, 2-hour 15 marathons. So you look at that and you go, oh, hang on a minute, that's okay. So that's the thing, is that when we look at somebody and we gather that information, that's our job to make sure that we're not changing things too much if we don't need to. So someone may not look ideal, they may look like they're rolling in a lot, they may look like their ankles are nearly touching the ground, but they may have been in this style of shoe for a very long time. And then for us to change that dramatically, what we're doing is forcing load somewhere that they hasn't had it before. So we can cause changes. Does it mean that it's a bad change if it's gradual? Maybe not. Like, you know, sometimes people, especially a novice runner and someone that's just starting, you know, they might want to increase their running. So we may think, oh, listen, over time we might find that you could get a little bit sore in these areas. Maybe if you straighten things up or we go a bit firmer here, might disperse the load a bit more even. But I suppose it's always coming back down to those conversations. The biggest thing, so the shoe, making sure that it feels comfortable. Like a shoe has to give you, I suppose it has to fit your foot well, has to feel really comfortable, and it has to be something that you want to run in. So there's no point in going into shoes that I've been told to go in this, my foot type is this, and this is the sort of shoe I've got to go in. Doesn't feel really comfortable, but it'll stretch, it'll feel better, maybe I'll wear it in. They're big cues for us to say that we need to try something different. You need to, I suppose, if you don't go into a store like ours, there are other sort of things to look at in terms of shoes, and when you're trying on shoes, is be really specific and I suppose ask the questions and make sure when you're trying on shoes you're comparing them, and and feeling which one's giving you the sort of feedback that you want and that you think that you need as well. So there's definitely different, I suppose, a lot of different frames and a lot of different tech out there, and every brand selling a different sort of style. I suppose they're all going to give you a different experience, and it's just about finding which one's going to work for you and what you're sort of chasing. In terms of like shoe rotation, that's probably a big one. So there are a lot of new runners. There's the runner that has just started and they're doing park run and they're really enjoying it, and we hear all the time, oh, I'm not a really fast runner, I don't need anything fancy, or these types of things. Or, you know, you have your more experienced runner that's looking at, you know, getting faster, doing more sessions and you know, wanting to increase their running in a way that sort of is a little bit more competitive. I think that, you know, all shoes on the market now are designed for everybody. It's just finding the right one. We've got so many different shoes now, and we're so spoilt and lucky we have, you know, what I would call them before, boring shoes. No, they're not boring. But they're, you know, a bit more, I suppose, not old school, but, you know, they're stable, they're safe. We've been in them for a while. You know, then you've got your super trainers that, you know, high stack foams. Some of them have plates in them, some of them don't, but they're super fun, they're really light. And then you have your more racing shoes. So it's just about finding out where you sort of sit. The biggest thing for most people is making sure that the shoe that you choose is fitting your foot well, and you've got that nice surface area underneath your foot. So your more novice runner that might want to look at, you know, you've got a race coming up and you want to get a race shoe, instead of going out and potentially getting something that, you know, is really narrow in the heel, carbon plated, not as much area that your foot's sitting on, and so you feel like you're rolling in a little bit, maybe going into something that has a bit more of a wider last, it's straighter, but it still sits in that super trainer sort of area, which is, I probably should get those shoes actually, just to show you something. Maybe just one of the, maybe one of the Super Blast. Please, Lee. I'll just to give you, I'll try to be really quick. I told you I'll end up taking longer. Once I start talking, I suppose so. There's a big increase in racing shoes. There's a big increase in running in general. So you look at some of your top tier racing shoes, which is what I would call this shoe here. So if you look at that, we've got a really narrow heel counter. We've got a really curved last. So this section in through here is really narrow. And then you've got a little bit more of a broader sort of forefoot. So essentially, well, we saw it up there when people were running, like some of those people were running and they're still landing through the back of the heel and rolling through, but they're running at a pace that I can't even sprint. So their ground contact is less. So even though their foot's doing this, they're not spending much time there. So then you may get a runner that's running a 4-hour marathon and their foot, they're running a lot slower. And so their foot is staying grounded and spending a lot more time on the ground. So maybe something like this that is also, well, A, it's not plated, it gives a similar ride, higher stacked, which means that it feels nice and stiff and springy, so it gives a sense of having something like a carbon plate in it. But see how much wider that is in through the base. So when your foot is hitting the ground, you've got a lot more protection there. So you may not be getting as much of that aggressive sort of internal load as you said at land and sort of spend a bit longer on the ground. So there's different experiences between both of these shoes. I mean, this sits in your more super trainer versus your more racing shoe, but there still is a purpose for both. Maybe someone could still go in that's running a little slower, but they might be doing more intervals or a shorter fartlek session where they're only wearing the shoe and doing faster sprints for 30 seconds versus going out and running 5Ks or a half marathon or a marathon where their foot's continually loading and spending a lot of time in a maybe not so good position for the lower leg. So I suppose that's the difference between shoes and how you can sort of play around with it. I definitely think that regardless if you're a novice runner or an elite runner, we all should have an opportunity to run in fun shoes. And we all can run in them. We've just got to use them for the right purpose. And we've got to make sure that we're not using some of these shoes as a daily trainer and you're using them and you're starting to rotate them through. Yeah. I think I've covered off most. Did you want me to cover up any more?
It's up to you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Probably a good time. Questions?
Courtney, with that?
Did you mention something about like rotating shoes and then rotating shoes throughout the week? Or
Yeah, throughout the, I would almost say you could rotate. With most people, I would sort of say if you are going to rotate shoes, I would be rotating them for different purposes.
Yep.
So you might have something that's a bit more protective for your longer runs and your easy runs, and then you use something faster and lighter for your sessions, and then you use it on race day. So that's like, or if you're trail running and those sort of things as well. Yeah. So,
my question is, shoes for a marathon going to be different to shoes for like a half marathon, or when you get to those distances, are they kind of like?
I would say they're pretty similar now. Like I'd almost say some of your shoes that people are using for a marathon and these shoes, some people are like you're using them still for your 5K races and stuff as well. So there's definitely some that have lower stacks and the foams maybe they're a little firmer, which means they're not as forgiving. So like the higher stacked foams are the ones that you can sort of splay and they're quite springy and they don't hold their shape. Like some foams are a bit more resilient, so they hold their shape better. That can feel a little bit more harsh underfoot sometimes over a longer distance. So you'd probably steer towards them for something shorter. So that's where, like it's not as, it's just not as forgiving. But I definitely think that these shoes have probably just gone, most people are using them across all distances because they're getting less injured in some of those things. But that's where, if we're in carbon plated shoes all the time, I don't think that that's necessarily ideal either. So that's probably the answer to the question, like rotating stuff. You can be more specific, you can have these fun shoes, but as long as you're changing them in and out and sort of using them for the purpose that they're built for, which these shoes are built for faster stuff and other shoes are built for when you're spending more time on the ground. I was also going to say before when you were sort of saying dispersing, like that's probably another thing that I should talk about. you know, obviously these guys can do a lot and put things in shoes and padding and orthotics and those sort of things, which are really quite specific for each individual. With shoes, you know, like you could go into a store and it's like, oh, this is for overpronators, this is for neutral, this is for that. So I think all like categorizing shoes like that, yes, it is what it is. But it's not necessarily if you like say someone with that higher arch that's not getting much load through there. Sometimes we would look at a shoe that has a bit more contour and shape, which would maybe put it in that more supportive, like something like the Kayano, because the density of the foam sits up a little bit higher. And it sort of runs underneath the arch a little bit firmer, holds shape better a little bit, you know, whereas so when you're landing and getting force, it's more packed up in through there. So you can do things like that with shoes, and we do look at that in terms of foot types. So like this was probably like, you know, my sort of broad sort of area where you go through, but that's how we can play around with dispersing that load a little and making sure when we're hitting the force or we're getting load to that foot, that it's got something underneath it that's protecting it as well. Yeah. Any other questions before I stop? You've probably got more questions for these guys. Don't ask me what the best shoe is. Should I say the Superblast League?
Sorry, just one other clarification. So in terms of having kind of your shoe wardrobe, like for someone who's maybe amateur working up to a full marathon, would you recommend maybe like a set of say 3 different shoes, one of which is like a race day shoe?
If you could.
Is that
Yeah,
kind of like
I reckon probably two. Like I probably wouldn't, if you're working up to it, you'd probably find over that period you might play around with getting a third shoe. I definitely think, like I sort of said at the start, it's going to start from what shoe you're coming from. So there's always like, you know, it's quite specific when we talk about certain shoes, but you know, say, it just depends what you're wearing to start with. So that might be really suitable for your daily run. So you might be just getting one other shoe to jump into that rotation to start off with. You know, or like you haven't started doing like really long sessions yet, or like the types of sessions that you're adding into your training at that time might be a little bit different. So that's where it might only be 2 shoes. I definitely think the versatility of shoes now means that we can get away sometimes with 1 or 2. It just means they're not going to last as long. So I think, you know, once running becomes your sport and something that you're really enjoying, you know, you should treat yourself to that sort of stuff and not talk ourselves down as in we're not elite runners. We still need that and we use them all the time. And I suppose at the end of the day, a shoe that you get fitted for and feels amazing, you're going to want to wear all the time. So a lot of people are walking in their shoes every day. They go for a run and they go for a walk and they in their shoes for a while before they change over. And then, like I'll say to people all the time, you're always going to go with that in thinking and grab that shoe that feels best on your foot. And so if you're grabbing that shoe every single time for everything, whether it's walking and doing all those sort of things, then that shoe's going to be dead within 3 months, if not less. Like longevity and I suppose shoe, like I suppose the technology in shoes, it's great. It feels fun and it's lively, but they're not lasting as long. So that's probably a big thing as well. So that's why rotating shoes can also be better. Yeah. Yeah.
So we get used to wearing our shoes.
Yep.
So besides the very obvious sign that they're completely dead, what are some of the signs, or when should we be thinking about replacing them?
I would say like listening to your body a little bit more. So sometimes people will feel like, oh, everything has been fine, I'm starting to get really tight in my calves, or I'm starting to get really sore in certain areas, blisters, calluses. I don't think necessarily, well, maybe definitely some shoes now will show wear very heavily early on. Sometimes that is an indication that the foams are dead. But the other thing is some don't show that wear and they look really good. And like, so then people just keep wearing them and then you put it on next to another shoe and they would have been, sort of more compressed. I think we sort of talk to people majority of the time about, I suppose, around that sort of 600 kilometre mark would be when you'd be looking at changing most shoes. Some shoes aren't going to be as durable as that and some are going to be more. So I think sometimes it depends on, I suppose, the resilience of the foam. And that's where, if you know what that feels like, I suppose if you put on a shoe that's really squishy, you're like, oh wow, this feels like a marshmallow, maybe not last as long. Yeah. Whereas something that holds its shape a little bit better, maybe feels super cushion, but feels a little firmer and a bit more responsive, means that it's probably going to hold its shape a bit better and maybe last a little longer. Yeah. But I would say that, like, when you start to notice things, I get a bit sore, and it's not just my training. Yeah.
Do you have a best question, Renee?
Oh,
I'm
Best-
gonna put you on the spot here.
I'd probably say race questions. They
Best
were good questions, though. They were good questions. So yours is good as well. Yeah.
Alright.
Yeah.
Good. That might be our big one.
Yeah.
Alright,
Congratulations. Come in and see us and I'll answer more. With your voucher. Yeah.
All yours, Sauce?
Thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks, Renee.
That's all right.
Awesome. No, took that.
I always jump from one thing to another. I've got to get better at that.
So now we're going to change pace a little bit and start to talk about how we can actually stay robust and resilient, stay out in the running track, while also trying to optimise our performance. So we know to get better at something, we have to do more of it. We want to get better at performing, we want to get a PB, we want to achieve a marathon or half, whatever it is, then you need to run more, which is obviously right. And so as we run more, we can improve our performance. But as we do this, and if we continue to train more, our training stress will go up. We get to this point here where if we get to a point where we're overtraining, then our likelihood of injury starts to increase. So it's a trade-off here, and if you're in the elite sort of level, then you're probably pushing right up here, getting every ounce out of your performance, and you're really trifling with that edge of being injured all the time. So for most of us, we're trying to achieve this sort of steady state area where our performance is pretty good. We're doing the loading that we want to do, we're achieving the runs we want to do, but our risk of injury is low, and we're not in that sequence where we're overtraining and really pushing the envelope. So you really want to find that sweet spot where the body's in a harmonious state. So the next part will be some tips and strategies on how you can walk out of here and feel more confident, stronger with your running, but also learn how to stay healthy and robust, and some tips to take away that you can balance things out. If we think about injury, well, what is an injury? Well, an injury occurs when the stresses exceed the tissue capacity. So if we think about stresses, in this case it's running, and the parts of running that are stresses to us are things like running volume, running speed, running frequency, might be environmental factors like the surface, if you're doing hills, wind resistance, these sort of things are stresses. Tissue capacity, if you think about tissues being our muscles, our joints, our bones, our tendons, right? So if we have these stresses that are building up and we've got a really big program and that tissue capacity isn't where it needs to be, then we're running the risk of causing an injury. If we think about tissue health, and Jake touched on it previously, like some of the factors that might be considered in tissue health are things like what have you done across your lifespan. So we had the example of Ruby being a swimmer, taking up running later in life. She hasn't developed that bone resilience. She runs into problems with bone stress. A lot of it is what God has given you. We understand that with tissue health. But there is an element of underlying of building robustness. And what we do as exercise clinicians and how we use exercise and forces and different modalities of exercise to improve capacity and robustness of different tissues, we have access to that. And we have good research to prove that there's certain types of loading that affect tissues differently. So no doubt that we have a big effect on tissue health. The other thing that I want you to take away is that the best recovery really isn't the new age recovery boots, it's not ice baths, it's not infrared laser, walking the beach. These are all things that can help. The best thing for your recovery is giving your body the time to do what it's designed to do, and that's adapt to loads. So that's how we think about if we're programming runs. We're not coming in, and we see a lot of people coming in saying, what's the best recovery? I'm really sore, I haven't run for 2 years and now I really love it and I've just been running every day for a month. Well, they haven't really given their body time to adapt, and they've tipped it over the edge, and the balance has gone towards the stresses and of course injury. So recovery, it needs time. And then the other factor to consider with tissues is how we apply the stress. So if you're programming to reach a marathon, how are you designing that? How often are you running? How far are you running? and how quickly are you running, are you splitting up? We'll come to some of these concepts a little later. If you think about injuries that might occur, everyone's heard of shin splints, Achilles tendonitis, knee pain, plantar fasciitis. Put your hand up if you've had a running related injury, or they sound familiar. Yeah, it's probably why we're all here tonight. And so they're very common injuries that we see with overtraining, overuse, when we get out of balance between the stresses and the tissue capacity. How do we reduce this risk? Well, we have to consider a few things, and so we need to understand what's on the inside of our body. So these are things like what our muscles are doing, how they're producing force, how they're absorbing force, how springy our tendons are, how stiff our bones are, how good our aerobic system is to deal with the demands of running. And then things on the outside of the environment, like how your foot is interacting with the ground, your footwear, things like if you're doing hills, we talk about different surfaces, running on a camber regularly, doing trail runs. These are all the outside environmental factors. Not to mention the other really important, probably most important outside environmental factor is your training schedule. How you are mapping and programming out your runs is critical to ensure that you reduce your risk of injury. So if you think about, now we have the luxury with some of the tech companies, and we use VALD, who are leaders in the industry, of measuring forces and measuring things that are happening inside a body. And so in the last 8 to 10 years, this has become clinically available to us, whereas previously it was just available in a lab setting. So we have all this technology that we can use to understand what's happening with your muscle strength. We can understand how much force you're putting into the ground with force plates. We can understand how much power you're using to get off the ground, so how quickly your muscles are contracting to get off, how explosive they are. And we can measure how stiff you are when you hit the ground, which is important for us. If we think about you getting off the ground quickly and having a short gait cycle, then we think about being stiffer and shorter ground contact time. So we can measure all this stuff, and it's a real luxury now for us to know more, because 10 years ago it would have been a bit of a guess and a bit of an eyeball, and yet you look pretty good, your calf looks big enough, let's keep going. So what does running involve? So simplistically, what are the physical capacities that are required inside our body to be able to run? Well, we need strength, and if we're thinking about strength, we need to think muscles. So what are our muscles doing? How much force can they produce? Can they produce that force over and over again? And how quickly can they produce that force? If we're thinking about spring, we move away from muscles, we start to think about tendons. And the classic tendon that we all know about is your Achilles tendon, and that's the predominant spring mechanism that we see with running. So we need to think about the quality of that spring, the health of that spring. Is it functioning as it should? We need to think about stiffness. So how stiff is that spring? How quickly can you get off the ground? In certain injury instances, this is an important factor for us, because not that we've covered here tonight, that we know that different running techniques are normal, but if you're facing an injury, an overuse injury, you need to consider what your interaction is with the ground and how stiff you are and how quickly you can get off the ground. And then finally, explosiveness. So how quickly can your muscles contract to provide a really good environment, optimal environment for that spring to do its thing. And so we can measure that, and then thinking about the endurance of that explosiveness. Can your muscles produce the force quickly over and over and over again to be able to run 42 Ks, 10 Ks, or it's your first 5K? So these are the categories we'll break down a bit now. We think about strength, well, its ability to produce force. That's what strength really is. How do our muscles produce force? And we always use with our measurement, we look at peak force a lot of the time, because we know that there's multiples of body weight going through your leg. If you run at 5 minutes per kilometre, you see 3 to 4 body weights going through your lower limb. So we want your muscles to be able to produce a fair bit of force from the knee down, and then less so from the knee up when you're running slower. If you think about the strength of the lower limb like a chain, so your leg's a chain, it starts at your big toe, moves up through your foot to your Achilles and calf, into your quad and hamstring and then up into your glutes, so your lateral hip muscles. So if we think about this like a chain, and then if there's one part of the chain that is not doing its thing, it might be that you're sore in your knee and your quad's a bit weaker because you've got some knee pain, and then we know when we've got some pain that the quad gets a bit weaker. Again, you get this vicious cycle where you get, we call inhibition of the quad. If it's not pulling its weight and we've got a weak spot, then we know the load's going to be magnified in an area, and this can lead to injury. And so how do we know there's a weak link? Well, we can measure, as we showed in the previous slide, we can break down things into individual muscles, or we can look at the chain in its entirety when we jump onto the force plates. Here we've got an example how we might measure lower or calf strength. So the soleus muscle is the lower calf, and we sort of strap you in the force plate and then look at how much force you can produce in that soleus, and that's probably the most important muscle we have to think about when we're running. If we're testing, we identify deficit. We know what normal is for this test. We've got good data on that now from the research, and we can compare it towards your body weight, and we can understand where you sit. So that's really useful information for us about designing a program. If we are seeing a lack of force production in peak force, then we need to apply a strength program to do that. We have to be really specific on a dosage of exercise. So how many reps we do, how often, how heavy, and how much rest. So if you're working on peak force, it has to be quite a high intensity. So we have to be pushing really heavy. We use repetition maximum. So what this means is how many reps can you do for a certain load that you're pushing. So if we're thinking 2 to 6 reps, we want to fail in that window. So it has to be really heavy. The concept that we use to save us from the time of working out rep max is we use a reps in reserve. So if you come onto our sitting calf machine down here and you do 30 kilos, you do 5 reps, and you tell us that you could not do 2 more reps and possibly pull out 2 more, then that's about the right weight for you to get a strength adaptation. If we see you on there and you do 8 and you're like, I could do 2 or 3 more, then we're probably not in that realm of strength. We're probably endurance, and if it is an endurance factor and we've worked that out, that's great. But if we're working on peak force and strength, then we need to be more specific on that. So we do that. We talk about the strength and endurance. That would be a higher rep range than what a peak force would be. So we've tested your strength. We've cleared that that's good. You can produce the force. So you've got the force there, but now how does your spring operate? So we have to test the spring and stiffness. So I'll get everyone to stand up because we're going to stretch our legs anyway. Get it in spot. So we've talked about how there's no correct running technique, and that's right. But if we're thinking about the optimising the spring and the Achilles spring, if we're teaching someone to use that Achilles spring, we like to get forward onto the forefoot. So if you just do, if you're standing up, equal weight both legs, come from the heels just towards, so it feels like your knees are just coming over your laces. All right, so that's sort of where we want to get, we call that a midfoot intention. We're getting onto that midfoot. Right, so that's the first step that we need to think about. We start to then think about, right, how do we optimise that spring? If I'm going to do some jumps, I'm going to take my weight back now. So everyone take the weight back. And you're going to jump, and I want you to land on your heels. And see how that feels. All right, yeah, it doesn't feel that good. And now let's lean forward. So your heel's just about to raise off. You've got your knees over your laces. And then I want you to do some little jumps. And I want you to bounce and flip. Now I want you to come all the way up in your toes. And then I want you to do some jumps and stay up there and see that. So who felt best on number 2 or 3 or 1? Give me answers. 2. 3. I've got 2s and 3s. Someone said 1.
Oh,
Sammy. Yeah, it's a bit strange. So yeah, like 2 does feel better, and that's sort of where we like to teach people to optimise that spring. You really want to be getting into that position. It doesn't mean to say that if you're a heel strike runner, you need to change it because of that. But if you are facing injury or you've got injury history, we need to start to consider this. We go in and we correlate that with some numbers on the force plates, and we see that your spring's not that good. Well, this is something we might need to work on for your running. The reactive strength index is really, it's a complex number that we go on the force plates and we measure how long you're on the ground compared to how long you're in the air. And we've got some good normative data on that to say, we want to achieve this threshold to say that that's a good number compared to, say, elite runners. All right, can I have a seat? In terms of explosiveness, how quickly our muscles can contract, I might get Jacob onto. So these are our force plates. Obviously, if our muscles contract faster and stronger, we're going to perform better. We're going to run faster. I mean, that's a given. So if we are looking at explosiveness, we're thinking about, we just all did a little ankle bounce or a pogo. So we'll do these on the force plates. Here we're biasing more of the foot and ankle and calf. So if Jake does a little 10-5 pogo test, okay, so we're measuring, we call it a hop test. We can measure that on double leg, and we can look for asymmetries, and then we can measure on single leg too and compare left to right, because running is a single leg activity. If we're thinking that there might be a problem that's higher up the chain, it's not the foot and ankle, it's the knee, and then we can look at muscle power, muscle explosiveness, so we can do a squat jump. So we take Jake down and we hold. So here he can't use any stretch elasticity, can't use a spring. And I go 3, 2, 1, jump, and I cue him to jump as high as he can. So we're looking at ability to produce maximum power in his muscles. And then if I think it's higher up and he's got an issue with more of the spring around his knee and hips, so he's using that elastic recoil and jumping. So there we can start to drill down. Is it an elastic issue, a stiffness elastic issue around the foot and ankle? Is it an elastic issue around the knee? Or is it a muscle issue around the knee? So we can pick that apart and see where there's deficits and where the problem lies. So if we're thinking about ground contacts, that's great, and the forces and the strength and explosiveness, but what else do we need to be able to run? Well, technique can come into play here, and there's a type of running called pose running. I don't know if anyone's heard of pose running. No. So essentially, it's a type of running where you are thinking about having your gaze, you're staying upright, you're staying tall, and you're getting pulled forward. So keeping your head up is a good cue to keep your gaze on the horizon. So a lot of us get it and stuff, and I do the same, pounding away and looking at the ground, and that's sort of not a conducive position to be in when you're running, especially for long distance and improving performance. So some tips on running posture, keeping your gaze on the horizon, arms and hands relaxed and elbows in. We want to be aerodynamic, and we don't want to be overusing energy in our upper body, because that's not going to help us with our legs and our lungs. And then, so a drill that you can do, I won't make you stand up again, but to start with some of your runs is we just went through before how we get forward onto our midfoot. And so what you want to think about when you're starting a run is you're getting hooked by under the sternum and the chest, you're pulled up to the sky. And so as you run, you lean forward, and then you start to get into your stride. So you can practice that if you think you're a runner who's really sort of running upright and back, and you're not sort of floating along the ground. You can use that drill of sort of falling forward, getting into your stride. Talking about stride, and so we know there's no perfect stride, but if you are, once again, facing injury, we may start to look at what is happening with your stride length. And we know that there's really strong evidence around a lot of injuries, and going in and intervening by reducing your stride length can really help. So if you're someone who is really upright and you sort of reach out for the ground, you've got these huge long strides, and you're injured all the time, you've got knee pain or you've got ankle pain, then it might be something that you need to look at and intervene. And so reducing your stride length and getting that pressure underneath the centre of mass, really. So as you're moving forward along the ground, your feet are underneath you and you start to get this quicker cadence because you're not reaching out for as big a strides. So reduced stride length and increased step rate or cadence is something that you might look at if you have got an injury history. There's ways we can do that by cueing with a metronome, which is just a tick, at 60 beats per minute, which is pretty boring. So I'd suggest you go into Spotify, Apple Music, and there's BPM music, that's sort of hard energy music that goes at 160, and you can build up to 180 BPM. So if this is a problem for you and you've got injuries, we may intervene at that level. Different surfaces, I know working with footballers over the years, I know it's not long distance running, but they do a lot of running, and in the off season they would finish their season and go and run on athletics tracks and all these different types of surfaces, end up with Achilles problems and calf strains. So we would always encourage them to stick to a consistent surface. It's the change in surface that can pose the issue. But having said that, if you do want to run trails, I'm not saying you can't do it, as long as you're sort of picking your two surfaces that you're going to stick to and you're not changing it every week between trail, grass, road, athletics track. Try and pick it and stick to your one or two. We've come to load management. So the key variables that we need to be thinking about, simplistically, if you're doing it from scratch, is your distance. So starting to manage, if you are training, say, for a race, you need to begin with the end in mind and reverse engineer from where you want to get to. So if it's a 42k race, you start there. I want to run at this pace, so your speed, intensity, and then you've got to work your way back. And there's plenty of marathon training plans out there you can access online, as an example in a minute. But the three key variables, if you're not that serious about your running or you're just doing it casually, then the three things that you want to be thinking about are your distance, your speed, intensity, and your frequency of running. We talked about the importance of cycling your runs to ensure there's enough time for your body tissues to adapt. And so if you are programming towards a long run or a race, we've got the 10% rule. So if you're changing your variables each week between those three we talked about, we want to make sure there's no greater than 10%. We're working through our different run types, so we're not just going out and smashing as fast as we can, as long as we can every run. We're a bit more strategic around selecting our longer run day and then having our recovery runs. And we might have our short interval runs where we're doing some fartlek training. We might incorporate some hills in. So make sure you're quite select on doing that. Importance of adding in some off legs time, and you can still work on your aerobic system, so you can still get gains in your body systems, but not necessarily from running. If you want to be specific about different cross-training modality, you can work in an aerobic zone on the bike, upper body cross-train. So adding in some cross-training sessions is smart to get off your legs and give those tissues time to adapt. And then finally, if you are going for the big one, the marathon or the ultras or anything like that, making sure that you build up your weeks, and then you have download weeks where you drop back a bit, you don't bottom out, you drop back half, you go up again, as we saw in the graph before of Ruby, where she had these little undulating peaks, and finally she reached the mountain top. Some key tips to take away: we talked about the pace progression, know where you want to get to, and slowly build towards it with your faster run during the week, and then overlaying that into your longer run. Adding some intervals and hills is really good to build your aerobic strength and some of your aerobic endurance. And then we talked about how you might build slowly towards that long run. So an example of this, if you are training for a marathon, to go at 5 minutes per kilometre. So you can see we've split into, we've got, most importantly, we've got our rest days here where we're not running. We've got some smartly put cross-training days. We've got our easy run, and then this works into doing some intervals, some faster work, and then we've got our bigger runs on the weekend. We ideally coordinate that on the same